Hi there and welcome to AXSChat. I'm really pleased that we have Jonathan Hassell with us today. It's been a long time coming. I've known Jonathan for a number of years. We've talked about accessibility till the cows come home. We're going to talk about it some more. So
Yeah.
welcome, Jonathan. I'm really pleased to have you here.
Thanks, Neil. Really good to be here. Sorry it took so long.
It's okay. We've got you here now. So when we first started talking, you were at the BBC. I was working with the BBC. I still do some work with them. But you've done an awful lot of stuff since then, including finish off writing the British Standard for Web Accessibility, BS 8878, and you've written a book as well. So do you want to tell us a bit about them? And now you're doing stuff with open inclusion as well. So there's an
Sure,
awful lot that you're doing.
sure, exactly. Well, okay. I'll kind of do it in bits.
Okay.
Yeah, so when we were chatting when I was at the BBC, I was head of accessibility and usability. So the fun thing that I did was I brought usability and accessibility together. So a lot of people come at accessibility from the kind of angle of checklists and things like that. For me, it's always been about people, and I was really blessed to have a great experience at the BBC where I was able to do a huge amount of research into how people really use stuff, and so that's kind of informed everything that I've done since then. And Yeah, we kind of needed to do something with that, and around about 2006, I was asked to be part of some standard setting stuff in the UK. So we created PAS 78, which was one of the first standards in the world to look at accessibility from the perspective of how do you do this sort of thing, rather than what do you do, what's the technical stuff. We were really looking at, if I'm the person who owns a website and maybe I don't really understand most of this stuff, how do I get the people who are creating this for me to do it in the way that fulfills the values that I've got? Those values are that I want everyone to be able to use the site. So we did that PAS 78 in sort of 2006, and a couple of years later they said it needed to become a standard. So I headed up the work making that into a British standard, and we published that 2010. At that point, I kind of worked out that one of the things I loved more than anything, after having the experience of learning so much at the BBC, but also sharing it and, if you like, contrasting it with the other people on the committee that I wrote the standard with, who were from sort of the banking industry and from Google and from Vodafone and IBM, all sorts of different organizations. We looked at, how does this actually work where you are? What's the right way of doing this? And there was something pretty cool about that. So I left the BBC 2011 to kind of go out there and create my own business, helping people get good at this stuff. Yeah, I mean, that's where the book came from. There we are, plug for the book. So that's including a missing 20% by embedding web and mobile accessibility. Everyone who's ever written a book has to plug it. There you are, that's that done. And
I believe that you have someone really, fairly close to us as in the book.
yeah,
Maybe
yeah,
Deborah.
this is kind of cool because Deborah and I, so we've done this the other way around, where I was the one asking her the questions, yeah, I interviewed about 19 different people all over the world about what they thought of in terms of accessibility, what worked for them, what their particular experience was, because I was kind of interested in, we created this British standard. I wanted to know how people were using it. So yeah, Deborah was one of the people. We met at CSUN around 2011, I think it was, maybe. Yeah, I think it was. And we kind of realized that we were both into the same sort of thing, which is how to make this stuff doable. If you were a small or a large organization, how do you put together a program that says, we don't know anything about accessibility and we're going to try and make this the way we work? How do you do that? And that's what we tried to do in the British Standard. And so I met up with Deborah, and she said, we need this. This is really, really good stuff. So the next year, I'd had the idea of writing a book, because I remember this, it was really clear. I remember her saying there were two things that she didn't like about the British Standard. There were only two things. Number one, it was a standard, and standards sounded a little bit boring. And number two, that it was British, which made it sound like it was just for the Brits. So the next year I came back and I was writing a book so that it wasn't boring, well, hopefully not as boring, because it had her in it. My idea was to say, you know what, I know a lot of things about accessibility, but I know you guys. And so the best thing that I could do when I was writing a book was to try and pull in an understanding about, you know, how it's working in the States and how it's working in Qatar and Australia and all sorts of different places. Different industries, you know, education, sort of banking, kind of, you know, all sorts of things. So yeah, I wrote a book, and we've got loads of video that's attached to it. And so yeah, I was interviewing her, and then the really cool thing now is that we are now taking the British part of it as well. So literally over the last couple of days, I've been working on the first draft of standard ISO IEC 30071-1. Gosh, that's a sexy title. I thought Venus 8878 needed a bit of finessing, but forget about the number. This is the international version of what we were doing in Britain, and we're working on that with people from all over the world who agreed with Deborah that it was a really useful thing that needs to go everywhere. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
So this was my main problem with it as a multinational company. It's much harder for us to adopt national standards than it is for us to adopt international ones. So I'm really pleased to hear that there's an ISO brewing, because we like ISO as an organisation, because we understand it.
It's quite a lot of effort to do these things. So yeah, you make it well. Thank you.
I know. I'm part of WCAG, and they're a long time in the gestation. So. And I also want to say, you know, if Deborah also has a book to plug, have you got yours handy?
Yeah, absolutely. Plug your book, Deborah. Plug your book.
Absolutely.
She's now going to the.
Oh, shit.
Right.
I have mine here with me, you know.
I know.
And when we had, we had Ted Coyne with us about 6 months back. He had the perfectly placed bookshelf.
That's what I need to do.
A little tiny little bookshelf, which was just behind Ted's head. It was perfectly framed for every Skype conversation that he'd ever had.
Deborah, give us more of the book, not more.
Sorry.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, there you go. So I think it's time to hand over to Deborah to give you a bit of a grilling, Jonathan, because I'm just too soft.
But I love my partners saying, "Bring the book out, bring this." So thank you.
Absolutely.
But the question, and I think that Neil already said this, but I would say the thing that probably people get the most confused about is it's a British standard, and I know that you're now talking to ISO, and I agree with Neil. I think that's wonderful. But how does it tie with W3C, WCAG 2.0? Finally, the United States is going to refresh our Section 508 law, finally in October. As we said, you know, a lot of moving parts, so we know that's got to be done in a logical way. But the thing that I do like about the British standard is I do think it's clear. You really understand if you're there and how to get there and how to make sure it's really accessible. And sometimes some of the other things we see, it's still very gray. I know in the United States we're suing everybody over these issues, and you know, I've had people say, even we've talked about it on AXSChat, you Americans, oh, by the way, today is happy birthday to America. We're 240 years old, and as
over 39.
That's right, and as you know, the UK takes your independence back. That'll be interesting to see how you celebrate the day that you, you know, became, you know, the UK again and not part of Europe.
Sure.
Is anybody drinking tea today?
Maybe in Boston.
I'm not massively celebrating that one myself.
No.
I kind of like.
Yeah.
I think he's done a lot for accessibility, actually. So I wasn't so happy with my fellow Brits, but hey, everyone has their view, and they won.
Yeah.
We've been watching it in the U.S. with fascination, as I think the world has. So I just wish y'all great success with this, because I think a lot of stuff, important things are happening in the UK. But so back to how does it work with W3C, the WCAG standard, which so many countries have adopted, and I know it's addressed in the, I know we're addressing it in our U.S. legislation. So how does it work? But ISO also harmonized with W3C. So
they did.
I know that people will have questions about this.
Sure, exactly. So let's look at those head on. So I think the best way of thinking about it is to look at why the original, that PAS 78 thing was created. So it was created in the UK because people looked at, so that was WCAG 1 at the time rather than WCAG 2, but it's the same sort of thing. They looked at it and they said, this is really great for people who are kind of designers or developers. It's pretty good if you're a content author. But if you're the person trying to sort of, who's the strategic person, maybe you're the product owner, maybe you're the project manager, maybe you're the CEO of a company and you're thinking, why should I do this? And how should I do this? How should I set up my company to do this? There wasn't really very much there. So the idea of BS 8878 and the ISO standard that it will turn into is to really kind of complement and almost kind of fit around WCAG. WCAG is a brilliant way, if you're using the web as the set of technologies that you're using, to know in a very kind of detailed way for all of the guys at the coalface who do the implementation what they need to do. What it's not so good at is saying, why should you bother doing it anyway? How should you set up your organization to continue doing this sort of thing? And probably more than anything, how to make this a reasonable thing to do. So, I mean, if you think about it, even if we take all of the business cases around accessibility, and we can talk about them here, but I'm sure you'll have talked about them a lot beforehand. There's a lot to be gained from making your products accessible. The problem then comes to, well, what's the most efficient way of doing that? And WCAG is part of the answer, but it's not all of the answer. Because actually, if you compare it, for example, to what happens with inclusive design more generally, if I was doing inclusive design of a building or a fridge or whatever, it's all about process. It's all about how would I do this sort of thing. And so from my perspective, BS 8878 and the ISO standard that it will turn into is designed to say that's lovely WCAG thing. How do we make that work within an organization and a business so that this just becomes the way we work? And we've had a huge amount of success. Last week I was in Singapore, and I was working with a company who they had a project that was elongated by almost as much time. So it took 200% of the project time to make it accessible. It took a huge amount of time. It was really inefficient because they did a lot of the testing right at the end. And a lot of what we're talking about in the standard is to say, well, how do you change your business so you get good at doing this stuff? How do you train your business? How do you make it your policy? How do you say we're going to make sure right at the start of our project we don't forget about accessibility? So right at the end of it, when we come to test it, it's actually too late or too expensive to do anything about it. So that's the sort of stuff which is there in the standard.
And
yeah,
and
go ahead.
I'll bring you in a second, Deborah. But this is something that I absolutely encounter on a regular basis as part of a multinational, and some of it we are bringing in through process and procedure and everything else, and I know Deborah's going to address it in a second, but some of it has to be through pain-based learning. I think that, like you just talked about, they've gone through the pain, and that brings about the willingness to then address it more strategically. So sorry, Deborah, I did cut across you a bit there, but I also wanted to address the whole multinational angle.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think, you know, the interesting thing that we're asking of the multinationals is to figure out all these moving parts, and sometimes I think we're being very unreasonable. I know in some cases we are being unreasonable about this in the U.S. I just wanted you to address, and Neil, you might want to chime in on this as well, but I love the way, I've always enjoyed the way you talk, Jonathan. I've always enjoyed doing, I know we've done some presentations together too, but the very practical, common sense approach. But one thing that we keep seeing in the U.S. is we follow all the standards, all the advice that we're given, and you need to make it, you know, follow our laws in the U.S., just speaking from a U.S. perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Follow our laws, make sure you're following W3C standards, blah, blah, blah. And people are actually, corporations are doing this, technologists are doing this, but then like a month later they've been kicked out of compliance again, and so keeping it accessible. And so I was just wondering if you and maybe Neil want to talk just a little bit in this direction. That was one thing that I saw, that it seemed like it was a better, maybe using Neil's words, process to keep it, because if we're always having to go back, you know, so
sure.
I thought maybe I could address.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that, and I can also speak to the pain that Neil talks about. You know, I mean, our hope with the new standard is that people won't have to go through that pain to realize why you need to think about it in a process-based way. But if you like, if we can put it out there so that if you then realize that you need it because you've just done it in an awful way, then it's there for you. But ideally, people find it before they have to pay. You know, and Deborah, I'm parroting back to you exactly what you said to me in the interview that I did with you kind of years ago. I still use it. I use that bit of video with people where effectively we talk about sustainability, and we also talk about losses for the disabled community. You know, the big question that most people have when it comes to accessibility is, okay, if I'm now saying that it's worth doing, how much is this going to cost me? And from our perspective, we want to take as much inefficiency out of that as possible, because we know that what will happen when things get hard, if you leave things to the end, you know, we're using really kind of quite simple and well understood project management methodologies. You know, there's a really great curve that people know about. The cost of fixing a bug depends on how late you find it. If you find it at the end of the process, it may not even be possible for you to fix it before you're going live tomorrow. Certainly, if it is possible to fix it, it's going to be massively more expensive than if you found it right at the start. So a lot of what we're trying to do is to say, look, guys, let's get really efficient about it. Because if we can get efficient about it, then this stuff, we get all of the good things, but we don't have a huge sort of bill at the end of it to say, okay, you said you wanted to be accessible, it cost us 5 times more than we thought it was going to be. You know, that's at the point where people go back to the sort of thing you're talking about, which is, well, okay, what's the minimum we can do then? You know, I mean, who cares about whether or not it helps people? Let's use WCAG, because WCAG is, in a lot of cases, the minimum you need to do, especially when it comes to today, when we've got mobile and smartwatches and everything else. WCAG gives you the start. If you're just doing sort of like unresponsive web design, it probably gives you most of what you need technically. But even if you comply with all of that, if you're thinking about, if you're forgetting usability, if you're not actually saying, okay, it's good when a disabled person says they can use it, that is what we would term the kind of test drive way of thinking. We tend to think about testing in 2 different ways. If you think about when you're buying a car, you don't go into the car showroom if you're buying one from new and look at the specification sheet and go, oh yeah, it's like does 200 brake horsepower and it has this number of doors and things. That's it. I'll buy it. No one ever does that. But that is, if you like, the equivalent of the WCAG specification. Now, what you do is you get in it and you put your foot down, and if it feels right, if the acceleration is right for you, if everything is in the right places, if you feel comfortable in the chair, that's a car you're going to buy.
Yeah,
and so
I agree.
people want the test drive experience, which is why what we're looking at is, okay, WCAG is a great start. It tells you a lot of the things that you need to do so that when people get in the car, they have even the chance of having a good experience. But it's not sufficient. It's necessary but not sufficient. You need to actually look at this in terms of technology moves very quickly. We're now into places which WCAG tried to look into the future and try to work out what they would need to do for those. But if you're doing a hybrid app on mobile, WCAG is still great, but if you just move into native apps, it's a completely different set of standards. So it's like, how do you put something around that sort of stuff to say, whatever technology you're using, whatever year you're doing this in, are there some things that stay the same? And actually the things that stay the same are, how do you do this stuff in terms of making it an efficient part of what you do in your software development lifecycle process. So for me, they fit hand in glove, this and WCAG. Neil, over to you.
Yeah, I think it's again, we're going back to process, but also principles, the core principles. So the bits of WCAG that work for me are their core principles: the perceivable, operable, understandable, robust. The other stuff is getting into the weeds and can change with time and technology sets and everything else. So I agree with your answer. I think there are a couple of things that I would add to that. Where there are projects that are so late, like you've described, or the remediation is so tough, I think there is another option that companies take, and it's a cynical calculation. It's, what are my chances of getting sued? Can I put some money aside onto the risk register? And we don't want that. We want to avoid that. So if it's going to be 200% cost, then do you want the 200% cost, or do you want the 2 to 5% cost of doing it from inception? Because that's the reality of it. It does cost money, but it's actually a very small amount compared to the total cost of a project if you plan for it.
Yeah.
And painting that picture.
I mean, what we do when we train project managers, I was doing this last week, we actually introduced the whole process backwards. So we've broken it down now into kind of 4 workshops. We start off with the last workshop, which is, how do you know if your product is accessible enough to launch? And that is all based around, I'm not sure if that is cynical, Neil. Our way of looking at it is there is a risk of
it's reality. It is reality.
Product, but there is also the examples we use. I actually take back from my days in broadcasting, which is, if you have bought an advertising campaign, so you bought space on TV to promote your product, you cannot push back the deadline for launch. Therefore, if you're at that point where it's not as accessible as you'd like it to be, what do?
Oh, it goes on the risk register. Absolutely.
Exactly. So, and then what we do is we say, okay, well, that's how you handle that sort of situation. So we talk about accessibility statements and about how to sort of how to engage with your audience so that they know how to complain, how to let them know the reasons that you weren't able to make it accessible in the time you got. And sort of how they can sort of engage with that. But then we say, but wouldn't it be better if you not got into that situation in the first place? So let's pull back a little bit and then look at how you do things in terms of, you've now got some errors, some testing has found some issues with your product. How do you prioritize those? So we're massively practical with everything. And if you like, all the way through, we give people this idea that even if they are right at the end of their project, there is still something that they can learn. to make a better accessible sort of result of that project. But if they've then got a little bit, if they're doing the next project, they'll learn from all of that pain, because it is real pain. Legal departments and all the rest of it there about how much should we say, should we hide that our product is not accessible? Should we be open about it? What's going to get us into the least trouble? And all of that sort of thing. So, and then we just take it through from there and say, you know what, if you're looking at this point where everything becomes really stressed and costly because you're finding issues up here, can we bring it down to the point over here where actually, if you're doing it right at the start, people get what you're talking about, which is it doesn't need to cost that much more money.
That's right.
Applause, applause, applause.
I know
people like that sort of stuff,
Yeah, and I know that Antonio's got a question coming up. The last thing I'd say is that we like you, I believe in the overlap between usability, accessibility. That's why we call it inclusive user experience. And we do testing, like you say, with the cars. We do all of the basic, it's functional testing. It's like anything else. We're finding bugs. Accessibility problems are bugs. We find them, we try and fix them before we give it to the user to go out and experience. So I'm absolutely with you. So Antonio, over to you, mate.
Now, let me create a scenario here. Let's say that, I'm the co-founder of a brand new fintech app or system that doesn't have a clue about accessibility. So if you want to tell me, Antonio, you are going to save this amount of money if you build accessibility from the start, how much would I save?
How much?
Or just looking at the experience of your projects in terms of percentage, what will be my benefits? That's what I would like to have.
Yeah, so great question. Probably the first thing to say is we share offices with that fintech. So we share offices with a startup fintech. It's a banking app for students. So we do this stuff with the people around us. We also do it with huge companies as well. So how much are people going to save by doing this at the start rather than the end? It depends on the sort of project. It also depends on how competent all of the staff are who are creating that. So, the organization that we were chatting with last week, who had this kind of 200% thing, the reason they had that is because none of their staff knew anything about accessibility, because they were in a part of the world that didn't really get this sort of stuff. It wasn't on the statute books. There was no law requiring them to do it. They were working for a multinational, and so therefore the multinational required them to do it, but they'd never done this before. So part of it comes down to, if you like, the maturity of the organization. How much do they already know? How many mistakes are they going to make before actually they start understanding that a bit of training might really be a great idea and would save them a lot of money. But I mean, for some of the large organizations we've worked with, I estimated it was probably like a scale of 1.4, so 140%. So if you put this off, but then you decide that you're actually going to do it, the amount of work in terms of the project management to have all of these meetings about how do we deal with all of these errors that have been found, the governance side of the organization in terms of should we go live with this or not, the lawyers, if we're going to go live and it's not perfect yet, then what do we say about this? If you put all of the money that all of those parts of the business spends together, it's at least, I would say, about 1.4 times the amount of money that the project should have cost. And bearing in mind that we're talking probably, my book's called Including You're Missing 20%. Most certainly Western countries have about 20% of the population who have a disability. Therefore, if you were spending an extra 40% of your time trying to get your product to appeal to them, you have done something really stupid for your business. And what we're about is to say, actually, it's not 20% these days, really, because we've got a lot of older people, and also, I may break my arm skiing tomorrow. And so suddenly I'm not in those statistics, but I need an accessible solution to your product. So that number is a lot bigger than people think, but we want to make the cost as small as possible. So yeah, it could be 1.4, it could be 1.2, it could be it could be twice as much. Depending on the size of business that you've got, that could be millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of pounds if you make the wrong sort of decisions early in the project. And the wrong sort of decision is not making a decision at all, really, and just thinking, oh, well, we'll test it at the end. Does that give you at least some sort of answer? I'd need to.
That's perfect. Because continue this discussion even in the banking sector. I was listening to a group of people saying on the other day, oh, we just built this new app for our bank, it's going to be, so the millennials, they like to do things just with a click, and then somebody asked, no, are you telling me that the elderly people like complexity? So, so it's a bit. Sometimes people are a bit confused in terms of their target audience, and they don't realize if they do it in a certain way, they are basically doing something that works for everybody. That's.
I mean, the ideal is always to get something that works for everybody, but I mean, sometimes that's not possible. Again, another thing about the standards. The British standard and the one that we're putting together for ISO is that we are big enough and bold enough to be able to say, actually, it is not possible to make one product that works perfectly for everybody. Universal design is a theory. It is an ideal. It's not a reality that anyone makes. I defy anybody to create a product that will work perfectly for all four of us, let alone anyone else on the planet. Everybody really wants design for me. Everyone wants something that works for them. And so sometimes it's great when you can have something that helps lots of people. Things like captions helping SEO is just brilliant. It means it's much easier to sell the costs of actually putting captions on your video. If you're able to say, well, your search engine optimization is going to be better, that's two great things that come out of it. But there's a reason why captions are closed captions and not open captions these days. Because people like turning them on if they want them, or turning them off if they don't want them. And that's an example of kind of personalization. And so, from our angle, I think the way of putting it is we tried to really grapple with the reality of the hard stuff. Some of the things that W3C are doing now, but isn't there in WCAG 2.0. So all of the cognitive accessibility, there were very few people, who were dyslexic or who had learning difficulties who were involved in the work of putting together WCAG 2.0. You talk to people who were involved in that work, and they knew that they weren't doing something for necessarily everybody, but they thought some things were just too hard. These kind of edge cases, as it were. Well, these edge cases are real people.
There's a lot of them.
Exactly, there are a huge number of them, especially when it comes to dyslexia. I know, Neil, that's close to your heart. So,
yeah.
From my perspective, you have to look hard at this stuff, and the thing behind what we do in BS 8878 is we say, look, you don't have to bow down to any set of standards if your gut isn't telling you that it makes sense. If it's going to cost you a huge amount of money to help a tiny number of people, that might not be a sensible thing for you to do as a business. If it costs you a little amount to help loads of people, that it would be stupid for you not to do that. So let's start looking at these things. Similarly, if we're just looking at things in terms of whether it's WCAG or not, what audiences are we not actually catering for their needs? There's a huge number of things in WCAG that I think are more important than they're given credence to. So all of the things around being able to change the colors on pages, for example, can have a massive impact. I mean, Neil, you should speak about that one, not me.
I know, absolutely. So yeah, most of the stuff that's really important to people like me is in the AAAs, which no one stipulates the required. You go to the government requirements, you must meet WCAG 2 AA. Well, thanks.
Yeah.
Haven't met my needs. I mean, I spend my life implementing the needs of many millions of other people, just not mine. Because those are the requirements of government. So why we try and bring this into the usability angle is actually, and again, we talk about personalization because it is user preference. We want to be as flexible as possible, and that enables people to set their own and meet their own accessibility needs without even thinking that it's so much accessibility. Because again, if we look at the aging populations, what we've got is people that don't consider themselves to be disabled. People like my parents who, despite having a hearing aid, despite not being able to walk very far, don't like to consider themselves disabled. They've got a bit of trouble walking, they've got a bit of trouble hearing, eyesight's not quite as good as it could be, cataracts. Still don't consider themselves disabled, but they would quite like to be able to make the text bigger or change the color or make it louder or whatever.
Yeah.
So
I mean, from our angle, we see that lack of engaging with the needs of some of the users as actually really damaging the whole kind of business case behind accessibility. What we're trying to do, and the thing we're kind of obsessed with in Open Inclusion, the company that I founded, with a good friend of mine, Christine Hemphill, and she's an economist, and her angle on things is very much around how do we make this valuable? What's the return on investment for organizations that do this sort of stuff? If you're doing things just to avoid a law, you're going to do the minimum. If you're going to do things because you think it's actually going to potentially get you more profit, then if you can establish that, if you can actually get the metrics around that, then you don't have to fight for that in the future, because that would just be bad for business for you to do something different. One of the things we talk about is, and I've talked about a lot with some of the sorts of people who've been on your show in the past, people from the Helen Hamlin Centre and places like that in the UK, is that we have these kind of peaks and troughs on inclusive design. The times where people really, really sort of want to do it, and the times that they don't. And normally the peaks are around some sort of legislation. So organizations that have spent a lot of money getting stuff great for accessibility then may not bother the next year because, well, they want to know what was in it for them. And if it's just not being sued, if I'm not being sued this year, and I wasn't being sued last year and the year before and the year before, is that because I spent loads of money on accessibility? Or is that because no one was going to sue me in the first place? So you know what? Let's do an experiment. Let's forget about all that accessibility stuff, and then let's see if I'm sued this year. That's how people kind of fall back out of the best practice that a number of organizations got really great at and then fell away from. So what we're trying to do is to say, the last thing that you do when you're an organization, once you've started actually kind of doing this stuff, make sure you try and find some way of proving the value of it. Because if you don't do that, chances are in the future you'll kind of fall off the end of the important things again. So we try and make sure that it's sustainable as things go forwards.
So yeah, it's
well said. Well said.
So I know we've got to wrap it up because we've overshot our half hour, but I agree with you. We're no, it's all right. We're nattering, it's fine.
No, we love talking to you.
But absolutely needs to be sustainable. What I'm trying to do, and the analogy that I think I draw quite often when I'm talking to organizations, is that of information security.
Mm-hmm.
Because the guys from InfoSec used to come along right at the end of a project and go, no, you can't go live. We need you to stop everything, you know, and throw the InfoSec spanner into the works. Mm-hmm. And over a period of time, that became embedded into the organization. psyche, and effectively it's become part of business as usual now, and in fact it's continuing to grow as a part of all of this sort of IT business. We're consistently bringing on more cybersecurity people within the organization. So I want accessibility and inclusion to be similar in the way that we interweave our skills and methodologies into the organizational DNA and the BAU aspects, business as usual aspects of our doing business, so that it doesn't become this do it once then forget thing, that it's actually just these things, a bit like now you wouldn't think twice about putting your seatbelt on, but once upon a time you had to run campaigns about it, that it becomes something that we do almost unthinkingly. Yes, we need to think about it, but it's not something we have to think about doing.
Yeah, I think the other. I think we're better than InfoSec. I completely.
Well, of course we are, but
InfoSec is basically making sure that the best thing that you can ever get with InfoSec is that no big problem happens. You're making sure that a big problem doesn't happen. If you do accessibility, you get more audience. You make more money.
Yes,
that's
true.
A win. That's not avoiding losing. And so to me, this stuff should almost be kind of considered to be just a sensible business investment decision in a positive direction. We're not talking insurance just.
No, it is. Thank you, Jonathan. It's been great chatting to you.
You're very welcome.
Look forward to seeing you on Twitter tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. Bring it on. Bring it on.
Thank you, Jonathan.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.